Welcome to this special episode of Frequency Matters, the RF Microwave Update series. I'm Pat Hindle, and today I'm talking with Tom Cole, Vice President of Sales and Marketing at Integra Technologies. Tom, welcome back to the show. You've been on several times.
Thanks, Pat. It's always fun to be back with you and looking forward to our discussion as always.
Excellent. So you and I have been talking about, this high voltage GaN since 2019. You were the person who sat down with me and made the case that the industry needed to move beyond the 50 volt GaN. And looking back at that arc from the early high voltage GaN thesis through the 100 volt production milestone that you reached to where you are sitting today, what surprised you the most about the market, actually adopting this technology versus how you expected it would be?
Yeah, I think we've been surprised very pleasantly on many facets, but I think the one that sticks out the most to me and is the most notable is the fact that the customers who I would have expected, of course, you always have those who lean into new technology and adopt it very quickly. But what surprised me the most is some of the larger entities that we work with who are typically the risk averse and typically the second or third mover on a new technology until it's proven and there's a lot of accumulated data. Those entities have jumped in with both feet for very, very quickly compared to what I would have expected in the industry. So as a recovering engineer, gone to marketing, I always know that my aspirations may be very large. I wouldn't have expected them to make the leap so quickly, and they certainly have.
And so in our 2023 conversation, you talked about swap C improvements that the high voltage GaN enables. And then in 2024, we got into the new high power levels being achieved. And now that 100 volt GaN is a production reality and customers have real system hours on it, what are the actual results looking like? Are there the swap C squared numbers that you expected? And, how is that going in the field?
Yes, it's going very well, both on the solid state side as well as the vacuum electron device side. So when we look at replacing solid state devices, it comes out in the savings on the power combiners and the power splitters and the redundant cabling and even the housings and the metal and the cabinets. All of that gets greatly reduced and has been very substantial savings for our customer base as they've gone to high voltage GaN. On the tube side, it becomes a very interesting learning experience for us as solid state people, because we're realizing now that with the very large rooms of capacitors and the drop transformers and all of this other infrastructure for these extremely high voltage power supplies that run a tube, if we can replace those, as we have been doing for power levels into the megawatts with solid state, it saves an amazing amount of real estate, both in terms of what it takes to implement. When you start with transistors that are 7, 8, 9 kilowatts, you can architect a system that is a fraction of the total space required for some of these larger entities. So happy to say that swap C squared is doing very well. And that complexity factor that we've added onto things has been the key and instrumental piece, working with the system architects as we've been doing to proliferate high voltage GaN into a variety of different end markets and applications.
Yeah, you've really changed the paradigm there. Great to see. So when we discussed the digital palette approach in the past interviews, it was still somewhat novel to the radar designers. So now in 2026, with the digital intelligence embedded in the palette, how has that conversation with the system architects evolved? And are they asking different questions about the design, how you were at the table as compared to 3 or 4 years ago?
Yes, with the new platform, and I'm happy to say we're actually going to be showing it in the booth. We're going to have one of our systems there, and we'll have it uncovered so that you can actually see how the high voltage GaN palette integrates into the rest of the digital architecture. But with this solution, it becomes a real enabler for different types of command and control monitoring and use. So what we found is by bringing the power levels from a component, typically what you would think of in the hundreds of watts, into the multi-kilowatt realm, The system architects really look for that digital interface to be there so that it makes it easier to integrate this. So system power in a component form factor with a digital interface and controllability. So now it simplifies the architecture of these very large high power SSPAs, and they can control it from a digital word, they can monitor it, and it makes the entire integration, if you will, a much more straightforward task. So what we're seeing is a pull for that type of technology where, because the power levels are now at system power in a component form factor, they would like a system interface to it too. Hence the digital architecture that we've done.
And you've said Integra acts now as a co-architect, not just as a component supplier, as you just kind of covered. Your system engineers sit alongside customers and help them redesign the signal chain. For a system architect reading that's who's skeptical about the transistor vendor, that you can really make it work, what does that engagement model actually look like in practice? And where does Integra responsibly end and the customer begin?
Yeah, so it's been a fascinating change of that paradigm for us. So we have some very talented and very long term industry system architects that work at Integra. And how this engagement typically goes is we are working with the customers really at the design phase. And it starts with a discussion about what's the largest power level per device you can achieve for my given set of requirements. And that might be a pulse width, a duty cycle, whatever the specific use case is. And from that, we can work and determine, and this is a very unique thing with Integra, we have developed and validated a integrated RF and thermal model. And what that allows us to do in simulation space in a matter of days or weeks is to be able to take a whole range of operating conditions. And ultimately, since with high voltage GaN, we're always going to be thermally limited in the multi-kilowatt realm. But now what we can do in simulation space is to determine the maximum power level per device or a range of that for our end customers. And that architect now can take those different, I'll call them, bounds of the box, and they can ultimately take the size of the transistor, its performance in terms of the power level, and what that means in terms of the system trade. How many do you need? How big is the system? How much do we push to the individual devices versus how much more performance we can get if we do a little more power combination. And these trade-offs can be done very quickly. So I think one of our customers recently, we did 384 different simulation cases for them in a matter of 2 weeks. And that really allowed them to sit down and look at the continuum of how much system performance they could get versus how big it is, versus how efficient it is, versus the power supplies required. And all of that can now be done at a simulation level, and it can be done at the design phase. So this is really the change, is we are sitting down with Integra's personnel at those system architecture discussions and going back and forth with the trades between how much we can do per device and what that means to the ultimate system. So fascinating journey and a much different engagement model at Integra now than we had 5 or 6 years ago prior to high voltage GaN.
Yeah, that's excellent. You'd be able to take in all those trade-offs, especially thermal concerns are definitely a huge issue here. So you need to simulate those, take them into account, and you can get the right trade-offs. So that's awesome. So the
Yep.
vacuum electron device replacement story was where this whole journey started in 2019. You're replacing klystrons and TWTs with solid state for very high power applications. So Integra and Whirlitone have been collaborating on a scalable solid state power amplifier solution, and this is for megawatt level replacement of TWTs and VEDs. Where does that stand now? Is the solid state VED replacement story for the high power microwave and scientific applications actually happening at scale? Where are you doing with the win by design win battle?
Yes. So I think the fun part has been watching the speed at which this is happening. and that's being pushed along, of course, by supply chain issues on the vacuum electron side, as well as just engineering talent and a wave of retirements there without backfill that's really driving a lot of different entities to re-architect. And I'm happy to say with high voltage GaN. So Whirlitone's been a great collaborator with Integra. So with our high voltage GaN technology combined with Whirlitone's very low loss and extremely high power combining technologies, we've been able to work with a number of different entities to architect solid state replacements into the megawatt power level realm. And that is something that we're actively doing not only on the scientific side, but even into the defense radar side. So something new, and again, hearkening back to what I said about some of the entities that you would have expected to be more risk averse, leaning into the technology because of what it can do ultimately to allow them to have a solid state replacement for a vacuum electron device. So it's been a fun journey. We're really seeing multiple different cases and new end markets that are pursuing us, even into, believe it or not, the fusion realm. And again, these are extremely high power levels and needing to be very agilely controlled with different waveforms, all of these things that lend themselves very well to solid state. And so with the connection with Integra and Whirlitone, we continue to partner and to help our system architects at various customers have different solutions that we combine with the high voltage GaN and Whirlitone's combining technology to produce these megawatt SSPAs in a very, I'll call it practical form factor.
Yeah, the industry's been talking about that for years, so glad to see it's finally happening at those power levels. So for the Defense Prime supply chain team, how do you give them the confidence in your process consistency, yield, and long-term supply availability? And how does that conversation start as DoD has gotten more involved and focused on domestic semiconductor supply chains?
Yeah, it's been quite an evolution, and I'll say that with the recent LDMOS obsolescence and closure notices that are happening in our industry, it's a very salient point right now with a lot of our end customer base. So really, if you look at the elegance of doing this, and certainly Integra is very instrumental, and a core value of ours is long-term program support. Believe it or not, we are still shipping silicon bipolar for the next round of airport radar S-band radar upgrades. That will be our third consecutive generational upgrade of that particular system. So an extremely long-term program. And part of the elegance is focusing on the fab aspect. So with our high voltage GaN, it is produced on the same process lines that date back all the way to the 28 volt GaN. So if you think of the fab as a kitchen, the kitchen really doesn't care if you're making filet mignon or if you're making a salad. It uses the same type of equipment. So the key to having a very long-term supply chain and having one domestically, of course, which Integra 100% is that we can have a part produced for 150 volt, kind of on our leading edge of technology, and it's made on the same line as our 28 volt. So what that does is it enables you to have a very long-term stable supply chain that does not suffer from some of the obsolescence notices that we are seeing around the industry today from other entities.
And so every time we talk, you've really pushed the voltage ceiling higher from 50 volt conventional GaN to 100 volt and now 150 volt in production. So I've heard whispers about what comes next. Integra's been developing, 150 volt GaN on silicon carbide technology with power densities up to 30 watts per millimeter. That's amazing. Up to 6 times greater than the 50 volt GaN, as a next generation beyond the 100 volt. What's your roadmap for that? And, tell our audience where you are taking Integra with the high voltage GaN from here and any new system architectures that this enables with the high voltage level to be able to unlock new possibilities.
Oh, certainly. So happy to say that we'll give a little peek behind the curtain here. And at our booth, which is 21029 at IMS, we're actually going to be showing some of this hardware. So let me start with the process level. As always, if you can go to higher voltage, you can have substantial improvements in efficiency. You can get a much higher power density. And so, one of the things that we are working on, always forward looking to the future, and being pulled, quite frankly, from a number of different applications, including some of the new medical and critical inspection linear accelerators. Believe it or not, there are linear accelerators that are just about handheld. And these are fascinating devices that would love to have a 200-volt process. And that is one of the things that we have begun working on. The power densities are looking amazing. And again, these are ways that the technology will be pulled forward. And as always, when we release a given process node, we do that multi-market. It keeps the fab very level loaded, which is another key aspect of supply chain. But it also allows us to help drive that innovation with the architects that we work with. So, for example, at IMS this year, we are actually going to be introducing and have in our booth the industry's first 10 kilowatt single transistors. And
Wow.
so we've finally breached that 10 kilowatt mark that we envisioned a long time ago at Integra, and I'm happy to say that our engineering teams and our scientists that create the processes and actually design the devices have been able to really drive that innovation forward. So we will have a 10 kilowatt IFF transistor that's for L-band avionics, and we will also have a 10 kilowatt UHF radar part. And again, I would expect very quickly, as typically happens, that we will have a number of other derivative products as customers pull us into specific needs that they have. And that's another aspect of Integra. We're not a catalog house in the sense of that's all we do. We will put out demonstrators, and very quickly customers will ask us for, hey, I need a different frequency band, or I need a different power level, or can you do this, or can you do that? And we're always happy to collaborate in those ways for our strategic customers and help them to be able to come up with, again, a new leap forward for them in terms of swap C squared or other aspects of system performance that weren't possible prior to these types of power levels.
Wow, that's amazing. 10 kilowatts at L-band. Never been done before, so thank you for introducing it here. So last question, and I always kind of ask a version of this each year. You know, when you and I started the conversation in 2019, the skeptics said that high voltage GaN above 50 volts was too risky, too hard to qualify, and that the market wasn't ready. You know, you've proven them wrong even at 100 volts, and you're still, encountering some level of skepticism with the technology as you move forward. Are you still seeing that?
It's quite a difference in that world. So when we were evangelizing high voltage GaN in the 2018 and early phases, yes, we had many skeptics, and rightfully so. The question I always had was, how can a small company like Integra innovate to this level? And we always joked and said, well, there's things that you'll see in other markets. Ask Blockbuster about this little startup Netflix in retrospect. So for us, I think the biggest change has been now, instead of the skepticism, we have people on our strategic customers and those that we work with who now, when I come out with something, automatically raise the ante. And so if I come out with something that's 8 kilowatts, they say, hey, that's great. Can you get me to 9? Can you get me to 10? So the biggest change is really that they've adopted the technology. They believe it based on the data that we have provided, and being able to actually test it, evaluate it in their own lab, see the performance that we claim, and typically see a little better than what we put on our data sheets. And at the end of the day, now they're bought in. So now they want to use it, and they've become, I'll say, the drivers of even higher level performance versus what was a wave of skepticism when we began the journey back in 2018 and 2019.
Well, great. Thanks for talking with me today, Tom. I really appreciate coming on again. You know, you have the industry's first 10 kilowatt transistor operating in L-band. Congratulations. Amazing accomplishment and, hats off on your team. You went from 1 kilowatt to 10 kilowatts over this time frame, which is pretty amazing, factor of 10 there. So we'll follow this new development closely and sure to have you back again next year. It's become an annual thing with us. And to our audience, you can find more videos at videos.microwavejournal.com. Thanks for watching.